Hi, everybody. So we're going to get the roundtable session started for today. But firstly, I want to introduce myself and a co-respondent as well. We're going to introduce ourselves, tell you a little bit about how we are kind of involved with this work, and then introduce the speakers really quickly for folks who perhaps weren't here earlier for the introductions, and then we're going to get into some questions, both from ourselves and the audience. So firstly, my name is Bokeh Saisi. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Ethnic Studies Department, and I come to this through thinking about badness studies and disability studies in terms of incarceration, particularly around Black and Indigenous women in Canada and the US, and thinking about structures of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism and how they produce the conditions of possibility for that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hina. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Ethnic Studies program. My work and my organizing is primarily in Northwest Pakistan. I work also organizing with a group called SWANA in San Diego, so that stands for Southwest Asian North African. We do a lot of work with the most hyper-militarized spaces in the world these days. The region that I work with is the most drone-stricken region in the world. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced from that region. And a lot of the intersections that I have are about questioning what it means to have state violence. And our implications, being in the exact building, we're on the 5th floor of this building, is a drone project. So how do we have accountability for these things? What does that mean to normalize drones? Drones, by the way, are being normalized as a surveillance project for the police. So, you know, nice to talk about all these things. Can't wait with all the brilliant speakers that we have today. So hello.
And I do want to acknowledge that we are on Kumeyaay land. So as someone who studies settler colonialism, I want to make known that this is land that is often unceded, and thinking about the ways in which that we're all complicit in land dispossession as well. All right. So firstly, I'm just going to highlight quick and brief introductions to each of these speakers. So firstly, and I'll go in the order of the way folks are sitting. So firstly, Leroy Moore is a poet, performance artist, activist, and is a founding member of the National Black Disability Coalition and co-founder of the Oakland-based theater group Sins Invalid, and a leader of the Crip Hop movement. Dr. Nirmala Erevelles is the professor of social and cultural studies and education at the University of Alabama. She publishes on topics related to disability, in particular the ways social oppression is pervasive due to differences in race, socioeconomic status, and bodies. Anna Mollow's research interests include disability studies, crip theory, fat studies, feminism, queer studies, and critical race studies. She is the co-editor with Robert McRuer of Sex and Disability. Khalid Alexander is a founder and president of Pillars of the Community, a grassroots organization dedicated to advocating for those impacted by the criminal justice system. And last but not least, Dustin Gibson is a community builder, co-founder of Disability Advocates for Rights and Transition, and spoke about a variety of intersections that I think we really are trying to get at with this talk. I think I'm actually going to open up the floor firstly to see if anybody has any questions pressingly. Yes.
Hi there, I'm Suzanne Stoltz, and I have been thinking about Dustin's definition of ableism, which was really thought-provoking. And so I'm curious, it describes ableism as anti-Black, and others on the panel have also spoken about ableism, how it is somehow dependent on racism. And so I wonder if you can talk more about your thinking around that. It'd be interesting to hear more.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can't take like full credit for the definition. There's a person I mentioned earlier, Talila Lewis, T.L. Lewis, that we kind of co-create definitions of ableism with the understanding that there are some core components to it. One, that it is anti-Black. Another that it places value on folks for a variety of different reasons, typically for production reasons, like in profit. Also, it monitors and polices our behavior. It surveils us, and it also so anyways, those are some of the core components to it. The fact that it's anti-black, I think, is to speak to the pathology of race and disability at the same time, in particular in the States or in Turtle Island. So it's talking about things like intelligence and the way that we view that. In like modern era, like we can talk about like the achievement gap. And it's if you test low with an IQ, right? That's a standardized test. Then you're considered disabled. But we also live in a country that is illegal to read for black folks. So when we think about race and disability, those are tied. So ableism and racism have to come together.
All right, so, another question?
I have a question. Unless other people want to answer that question. No? Okay. You know, I was just the statement that Khalid made that civil rights don't, as many of us know, civil rights don't necessarily guarantee human rights or humanity, I think is a really productive and something we talk about way of thinking about intersectionality. I think without naming the various types of groups, that very concept, because we often talk about in disability studies the idea of being invalidated, you know, as an aspect of disability rights, but certainly being invalidated is part of. But what I was interested in is, first of all, talking about how that could potentially be a rich point for thinking about what intersectionality is, a way of getting at it. But also thinking about it in relationship to your idea about, on the one hand, civil rights don't function through voting, and yet a lot of what you're pushing for is this. So I want to separate out these two questions, but they're two questions. So I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which I'm interested in ignorance studies and a lot of ways in which ignorance is generated. And so, you know, this general ignorance of that fact, of the fact that civil rights don't guarantee, because those of us who can comfortably feel that civil rights are engendering human rights. It's a large portion of our population. It's easy to, you know, for many people to fall outside of that. So I guess, how do you deal with that sort of, those forms of ignorance? Just for you, for the panel.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So I want to make sure I understand the context, right? Because there's somewhat of a contradiction there, right? Yeah. Between saying, hey, in order to gain our human rights, we need to advocate for our civil rights, but the civil rights are kind of bullshit anyways. Yeah. And so what does that mean?
Well, I mean, I didn't take it to you said that civil rights are bullshit. They're bullshit unless they're coupled with other enabling factors. Right?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of one of the contradictions that's inherent because of our Constitution, right? So we have this whole idea that all men are created equal, but it was built in a very unequal way. I mean, it was built off of the genocide, as she alluded to, of the indigenous First Nation people here, and the enslavement of African Americans in the United States. And we wouldn't have what we have today without those things. And so I always am in constant conflict with those issues also. So up until, I think the first time, honestly, that I voted was 3 years ago. And I didn't vote for any individuals. I just voted for a couple of the propositions that were there. And so I've always had an antagonistic view of voting in that kind of term of civic engagement. The problem is over the last few years, or the good thing is I've seen the direct impact voting or not voting can actually have on people. So for example, Bonnie Dumanis was elected into office. Right now we have a race for district attorney. Whoever's the district attorney is going to have a huge impact on the every day-to-day lives of citizens and non-citizens, right? So that contradiction, I think, is very American, very kind of USA American. And it's both what's ugly and what I hate about this country, but it's also what I love about this country. because it's also what enables us to fight for something. And so, I'm proud to be an American, but, being American and the American that I'm proud of is not George Washington and apple pie. It's more of Malcolm X, Paul Robeson, and bean pies, which are sold by the Nation of Islam, right? I love bean pies. Not a huge fan of apple pie. That joke goes over better in Southeast. But so I don't know. But what I love about being American is the ability to fight back, and the necessity, particularly in Black America, to fight back for those things and to constantly fight for our own human rights. And hopefully somebody else will be able to answer that question a little bit more. Bang, tag.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I was going to answer it a little differently, and it's kind of cool because if I explain it well today, I can explain it to this doctoral student who's writing this exam on disability and human rights and civil rights books. And yes, okay, yeah. So part of the problem with, I'm going to go with the thing that it's not that it's bullshit, but the civil rights and human rights do very dangerous work, and I'm relating it to the presentation I just did earlier, because access to civil rights for most of the other groups, like race, gender, sexuality, and identity, is based on a certain conceptualization of deviance that has been historically associated with particular understandings of disability. And so for us to make civil rights meaningful to whichever other population we are talking about right now has to have a serious engagement with how that group understands and engages disability. Otherwise, you have this thing, I may be Black, but I ain't stupid, or we're using all the ableist language. And so the argument has been then that in order to prove yourself to belong to these categories, human and civil, even because the student had done a brilliant paper on looking at Kant, and actually she was doing this paper on the notion of dignity and rights. And so I just wrote her comments, and we have to talk. That's why I have to explain it to her now on the phone, because she's at York University, was the argument that the very foundations of the philosophical foundations are built on categories that are ableist. And that's why I want to go, the thing I really liked about what Dustin was saying earlier was every one of that I was writing down, it's those notions of even ability were based on anti-Blackness, right? Like certain activities that Black people could do were devalued, or indigenous populations. And all we appropriated them and made them our stuff and then used it. So, placing value, monitor, the ways in which it produces surveillance. All those parts of the definition are the very things that sustain this meaning of what is civil and what is human. And unless we engage them in a more meaningful fashion, engage them along with the claiming of humanity, or our humanity or humanness, or whatever that means, they're actually bullshit. Then I have to say the word bullshit. Okay.
Leroy Moore here. I think at age 50 and being an activist since I was 10, I take a different view. I don't rely on the state's approval for my rights. Of course, we have to enforce it and stuff. But really, when I come back to my community, those are the people that enforce my identity and my rights. I just think that we constantly look at the state to give us approval, and we know time and time again the state doesn't, And so, once we hit that wall constantly, we have to back up from that wall and say, okay, what else can we do? And I think really locally, coming back to your community and doing the work, and then in your community, realize your identities, disability, queerness, and and so on. and having the community to be open and to have that knowledge around our identities, so they can realize and how to live together with our identities. That's the real, I think, real work that needs to happen, because the state changes, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, the state changes constantly. But if we can come back to our communities and say, I'm a person with a disability, there's disability justice, can you sit down and learn with me, and let's implement this in our neighborhood from street to street, then we can see ourselves more wider, and constantly looking for the state to approve us.
Can everyone hear? So I think my response to that question would be that there's a lot to be gained from having an activism and a politics and a theory that is not solely concerned with rights that the state or other people can grant to us, because that puts others in a position of power, and I think that it obscures the ways and the great variety of ways in which we do have the capacity to make political change. And I think about the feminist maxim that the personal is political. So in my talk this morning, I was talking about fat oppression, and I was talking about how fat oppression is used to uphold this new racism, this sort of modern day form of racism where one pretends not to be talking about race and may in fact actually believe that one is not talking about race, and yet is reinforcing racist ideas. So the thing about fat phobia, which does reinforce the new racism, is that in the world of fat phobia, we're not really in the realm of the new fat phobia at this time. We're still in the realm of the old fat phobia, by which I mean it is socially acceptable to make fat phobic statements, and I would guess that probably most people in this room have heard numerous fat phobic statements by liberals and progressives, and maybe even by yourselves and your families and friends and communities. So that's a place that we can start to think about political change without worrying about what the state may or may not do or agree with, that we can look at ourselves and to what extent are we engaging in fat phobia? Are we dieting? Are we encouraging other people to diet by saying things like, wow, you look great, have you lost weight? All of these ways, are we thinking that the only people that we would be in relationship with are thin people? There are just many, many examples of the way that we ourselves are perhaps engaging in fat phobia, and that we have the power to change that. And as we do so, to make these connections, which is part of what I highlighted this morning, that you cannot separate fat phobia from ableism, and you cannot separate it from racism and from racial violence. So by not only challenging our fat phobia, but challenging it, explaining it to our friends and family members who make these types of remarks, or when people make fun of Donald Trump by having cartoons that show that he's fat in the cartoon, that it's great to criticize Donald Trump, but do we want to criticize him by saying that fat people are bad? Does that really help us? I think that it actually harms us. So that would be my way of moving beyond questions about human rights and civil rights.
So this is Dustin, and I just kind of want to push back a little bit on what you said. I don't think that racism has evolved to this place where it's lessened to the point that there's like a new racism, and fat phobia needs to get to the point where it's a new fat phobia. Like, that does a disservice to the spirit of intersectionality and talking about these things as they interplay with each other. Also, I think it also comes from a really privileged place for anyone to say that we should not be concerned with what the state does. To put that into perspective, like, I mean, you yourself spoke today about Black folks being killed by police with impunity. That happens at an alarming rate. Actually, this year has happened at the highest rate since there's been some form of documentation. So we always have to be concerned with what the state does, and that is the actual problem. That we can't live in a world where we don't have to worry about being oppressed. And also, like, this idea of human rights, like, I don't necessarily know if I want to be classified as a human in America, because the things that America does to humans, like when we think about like the arguments in prison, it's like, is 15 days for solitary confinement torture or is it not? But like to think that we can isolate somebody in a 6x8 with brick walls, losing all audio or auditory or visual stimulation, and that's like the argument that we're having, like those are humans. So I do think that everything Nirmala said as well.
I saw a question at the back.
Okay, how you doing? So hopefully I can frame this from my chicken scratch. I guess this is building on what Dustin's saying. So Dustin, maybe you want to take a crack at this first. But so, okay, Malcolm X said that, paraphrasing here, but you know, Uncle Sam wants to keep us barking up the civil rights tree so that we don't know that there's a human rights tree. And one of my mentors, a young lord, Vicente Panama Alba, he said some months ago that there's no justice for black people in America. You know, after, you know, fighting for decades for this thing we're calling justice. And so I'm thinking about the idea of justice, whether it's disability justice, racial justice. And I'm thinking about, you know, this idea of human rights. But for Malcolm, human rights was tied to this idea of diaspora and this idea of, you know, that the borders or boundaries of nation and solidarity are not contained by like what we've been talking about so far as the state, right? So Dustin, you had a slide where there were kind of like 5 pillars that you were going to draw a relationship between, that were I think prison and schools, and the last one was solidarities. And I feel like you might have been offering some kind of idea of ways forward. So I was wondering if you might want to build on that, and if anybody else wanted to chime in about thinking or rethinking the shape, or, you know, the container that we're operating from.
That was a beautifully worded question. So yeah, and I guess I will start with like this concept that we organize with, is saying that the people impacted or the closest to the problems are the people with the solutions. And when I say that, I talk about it in my own experience as well. Like earlier during the talk, I mentioned there were 7 young people at a certain high school that had died from May to November. Those are young people that I know. There's 108 homicides in Allegheny County last year, where Pittsburgh is. A lot of those, well, not a lot, but some of those young people are people that I know. My father's best man in his wedding, my cousin, murdered my aunt, both who had schizophrenia, stabbed her 37 times. He is now serving life without parole. These are experiences that I am accustomed to. So when I talk about abolition, it's not like this flippant idea of like, let's destroy prisons just to destroy them, and people shouldn't be held accountable or atoned for what they've done. Like, not only are my family members in prison for doing bad things, but they're also in prison for, you know, not doing bad things. So it's like these like really central arguments that we have to wrestle with. And I think we do that by going to where people are and talking to the people that actually experience these things. So that slide that Kim referenced, it had schools, community, prisons, and jails on there. And those were in particular for people that do school to prison pipeline work. I see a lot of folks doing school to prison pipeline, more so now in the disability community, which is like really whitewashed and white led. So they go to schools, a place that is safe for them because they're protected at schools by what people refer to as school resource officers that are really cops. They're protected by the metal detectors. They're protected by the doors in a way that the students are not. So I think it's very important if we're doing school to prison pipeline that we should be in the school, we should be in the community that the school is in or the community that the kids are coming from to go to school and to go to jail and to also in the prisons. Those are the people that can tell you how the system works. We might not be able to digest it in an academic way because they might not be able to articulate it in language that we're used to in ivory towers. But they're saying things that are solution driven. They sound really basic, so a lot of the times folks with privilege are like, wait, like, you know, the way to, you know, reduce violence is to put a bench by a bus stop, or the way to reduce violence is to open up the fire hydrants in the summer so there's water there, or it's really simple things that folks are like, there has to be a more complex answer to it. But they've been screaming solutions, right? Like if we think about like what Ferguson looked like, and then what Charlotte looked like, and what Baltimore looks like, and what places all over the world and Palestine looks like. Palestine, by the way, which is the biggest prison in the world. If we think about the things that these people scream as we're in the streets, they're giving us the solutions. Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, and I want to say that we have to look at justice in a different way. Because we only look at justice as coming down from the courts, but justice is 24/7. When you go home and when you talk to your neighbor, that's justice. So we have to look at justice in a community way. And we have to realize that, you know, the quote-unquote prison pipeline work has become a nonprofit institution. So no wonder people are working on it now because they get grants from it. You know, this prison pipeline's been in the works since the 80s. My mom had to rescue me from special education, you know, in '79. You know, so it's not a new concept. It's getting more Ford Foundation grants so people can apply for it and make a career out of it. You know. Not really solving it. It's just exactly.
Thank you, David here. So I never thought that I would be saying any kind of endorsement for the state. It's not really my background. But I guess I just want to bring something in that really hasn't been part of this conversation all day, which is something that has deeply improved the lives of many of the people here, which is the Americans with Disability Act, which has absolutely changed lives. Something that activists insisted upon, something that took years to grow out of a disability rights movement, and which is an absolutely imperfect set legislation, right? It excludes trans people, it excludes people who are gender non-normative, but it has changed lives now for 28 years. So I guess I want to ask, since we're talking about race, disability, state, I want to bring in, at least in the American context, something that the state, through civil rights and disability rights activism and legislation, sort of came down on the side of what a state can do, again, imperfectly, for the benefit of lots of people in what could be argued as a piece of legislation that definitely has produced a form of social justice, i.e. stuff that is not about necessarily me, but is about improving the lives of people I may never meet. So how can we bring the ADA into this conversation?
It's interesting because in Berkeley, we've been trying to put the ADA into cases of police. And of course, because the police is a part of the state, they say, oh no, the ADA doesn't cover police. So once again, yeah, we have this lovely law that's on the books, but if you don't implement it, then and what the hell is it used for? So yeah, I think once again, going back to disability justice says yes, we see, we acknowledge disability rights, and we acknowledge the ADA and the 504 and all that stuff, and we couldn't be here without it. But on the other side, we have to realize that in San Francisco, I used to have an organization called Disabled Minorities Advocates for Disabled People of Color. And every ADA holiday or birthday, we had the Other Side Rally, where we had people of color, quote unquote, immigrants with disabilities, and saying that, the ADA didn't touch me. We still, people of color, black women still have 98% unemployment rate since the 80s to today. So, we're glad that the ADA is there, but we have to realize that it's been watered down, it's never been enforced, just like the 504, it's never been enforced. It's the same thing that's going on in South Africa. I was in South Africa 2 years ago. They had this lovely constitution, but it's not enforced. So it's like, so it is a catch-22 situation. Especially now with Trump in office, we can just, we see the ADA getting watered down every second of every day.
Could I just also respond to that? Actually, I will argue that it may have, but it actually impacts people differentially. And actually, I would argue, at least I can only speak in school situations because I'm in education, that, every one of those legislations has actually served to surveil black people, black children with and without disabilities in more brutal ways. So these laws, that's why I keep coming back to this notion of the laws, because the laws actually harm. Like if it had done anything, like if in my town, there's an entire school of children. Of course, the school is called Martin Luther King School, so it gives you the whole narrative, where there was like almost the entire school is labeled with a disability, and there are no resources. And this is post Brown versus Board of Education. It is post IDEA. It's post many iterations of IDEA. And then I don't know which one of you in the morning, one of them said that now, even when it's used, right, it was supposed to enable and provide access. And somebody said today that prisons have now become the spaces that are supposed to provide mental health care. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, part of the problem with liberal legal interventions is, while they do provide maybe a language or something, they benefit particular populations, and through those benefit renders and actually erases the experiences, the life experiences and the possibilities of others. And in this case, we of producing it at the intersections of race, class, and disability and gender, you see then whom will benefit, like the celebration seems a kind of, there's this kind of hollowness in the celebration for us to be able to talk about it. So.
And I'll add to that just like very quickly. I don't think the ADA necessarily changed lives. It changed the environment, and that environment was partly created by the state. So like I don't think the state should just get like the celebration for that. And also like what Nirmala was saying, like talking about the celebration of the ADA and how we uplift it, and it's one of the most comprehensive civil rights legislations in the world, in the history of the world. Yet, just this past summer, I worked with somebody that was incarcerated for an extended period of time. He transferred to a facility. At that new facility, he developed disabilities. He was no longer able to walk. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. There, he developed, some psychiatric disabilities. But upon his release, because the ADA is not covered in the prisons and the way that they classify disability is different, he was not permitted to leave the institution with his wheelchair. Now, this is somebody that cannot walk because of the conditions in the prison, yet they're releasing him on an accessible ramp outside with no wheelchair. So, like Nirmala was saying, like the celebration of the ADA is great, but a ramp without the wheelchair doesn't really matter if you can't walk. And they also gave him a bus pass too, and the bus wasn't accessible because ADA only covers, you know, certain places sometimes, depending on your affluence.
I want to address that also because I typically have a very controversial stance to when it comes to the state, when it comes to the United States, and all of these issues. The problem is, and Dustin alluded to this before in one of his responses, is Aaron Harvey, for example, when he was locked up under Penal Code 182.5, was the same time that Proposition 47 passed. Proposition 47 essentially took what in the courts was known as wobblers in the state of California. A wobbler is a crime that the district attorney can choose to either charge the person as with a felony or a misdemeanor. So when you have black and poor people who are being charged with the crime, you can guess which one they tended to be charged with as felonies. Whereas when you had, you know, a guy going to San Diego State University or UCSD who was caught with a certain amount of drugs or something, would tend to get a misdemeanor. After Proposition 47 passed, which was a retroactive law, he said we went from sleeping on the ground and not having room in bunks to half of the jail cells, half of the yard or the cell block that they were in being empty. The reason why I say that is because it's easy to have these philosophical conversations about the state from a bird's eye view. And those conversations are all totally correct. They're not incorrect. The problem is that there are impacts on individuals, many individuals, and we can't dismiss that. And so it's very difficult to avoid having complex, it's a complex conversation. And we can't say that voting is the solution. We can't say the state is the solution. It's not. We also can't dismiss some of the possibilities that are there. Now, anybody who only focuses on that or only focuses on not doing that is essentially, you know, one of the arguments that Douglas made to Abraham Lincoln when he was trying to get them to fight the Civil War was, why would you fight with one hand behind your back? Let black people fight too, right? So just because it's not perfect doesn't mean we should ignore it exactly. But you have to become educated. And once these laws are passed, you can't just sit there and not do anything, right? So we have this idea, oh, I voted for Obama, I'm going to sit back and not do anything, and then are upset. I'm a huge critic of Obama and a lot of the policies and things that he's done. But then we're upset when all of a sudden the world isn't this utopia that we thought that being engaged in state politics would bring to us. So it's a balance, and shit is complex, and we can't. We have to be able to look at all of the tools and all of the resources necessary to fight those things. One other example I'll give is I was like, I'll vote for propositions, but I'm not going to vote for people, because I think anybody stupid enough to run for office doesn't deserve to be leading anybody. And so I had this belief until I had a friend of mine who went before a federal judge. Federal judges are appointed. They're appointed by the president. And he was also a person who, under this case, was first charged according to the state. When the state lost the case with Aaron and Brandon, they put a lot of it into a federal court. Under the federal court, before this federal judge, I sat there and saw the prosecutor working with somebody who had worked with us in the community say, yes, this person's going to school now. Yes, this person's doing positive work in the communities. Yes, he's doing all of these types of things, but he still committed a crime, and he's still a pariah in the community that he's apart from. Now, everybody that was in the court was from that community, and they were all there to support him. The judge ended up giving like a 7 or 8 minute speech talking about how she would be remiss. She would be doing something criminal if she were to lock this person who was a positive influence in the streets up today for this supposed crime. If Trump had appointed that, or Bush, or any of these other people had appointed that judge, there's no way he wouldn't be serving a long amount of time in prison right now. And so I say to say, there are real impacts. That doesn't mean that I would vote still necessarily for or wholly endorse any of those things, but it's complicated. And especially when it deals with individual lives, this shit is complicated. And so it's very dangerous to try to dismiss it, any of these solutions completely.
I can't tell if I'm doing this right or not. Can you hear me now? Raise your hands. Visual, something. Yes, okay. I want to go back to the ADA. For people who are not familiar with the ADA, it's an unfunded mandate. What that means is the laws are there, but there's no punishment attached to the laws that would encourage businesses and other places that should be responsible for providing accessibility to provide it, which means the burden to get that accessibility is on people like me who are faced with barriers between what any other person without those barriers can just go in and take care of business and leave. And it's a long and exhausting fight every single time you're confronted with one of those barriers. I'm happy that the ADA is there, and I wish that the strength of the ADA had not been removed in order for the bill to be passed. What we haven't talked about now is the fact that HR 620 has already gone through the House of Representatives, and that is an act that is going to remove more strength from the ADA, which will directly affect me and other people who have disabilities or who are deaf or who are current stakeholders under the ADA as it is written. And this personally terrifies me. And it should terrify anybody, the 1/5 of all of the United States, people who have disabilities or who are covered under the ADA. Truly terrifying. And I don't think that backing away from voting is necessarily the answer. I think it's becoming more involved by pressuring the senators to do the right thing, because the ball's in their court right now. The House of Representatives already passed it and said, oh yeah, this is a great idea. Because sadly they are pro-business, and the people that are backing the bill have been saying again and again that it negatively affects our businesses, and there's all these lawsuits that we're given left, right, and center, and it's just from crooked lawyers that are trying to game the system, when it's a very small percentage of people that actually do that, and there's already things in the justice system set up to deal with that specific issue. It makes it that much harder for me to live a life of equity and inclusion when this law is not followed. And again, I just fear for my life and for the lives of my fellow friends and family members if further strength from this law is taken away.
Can I just, I just wanted to say, and I just want to be clear, when I was talking about it earlier, and I'm glad you pointed to this thing, like the dangers of HR 620 and the ways in which we are weakening ADA, I could see them as issues. Part of the problem is we also have to be able to engage these in the ways in which they affect different groups of people. It's not to say we get rid of, you throw the baby with the bathwater, I'm using the phrase right, but the ways in which we engage it, because Section 504 is also an interesting example, and I'm going to be very careful to say it's one of the it's actually stronger than I think the ADA in some ways, because it ensures equity, right?
Yeah, it's connected with education, yes.
Yeah, with education it ensures your access, and that you will actually have a better chance to have a free, appropriate education in the appropriate place, much better than if you were using IDEA for that. The problem, though, is that now, when I started asking questions in the school district where I live, a lot of the people I know who have children who kind of get who can use Section 504, a lot of my friends and colleagues, and I want them to have it, but they're all predominantly white, upper middle class, professors' children. When I asked a special education administrator in my school district, and what about other kids, we realized there was not one child who was African American or Latina who could have access to this. What Section 504 does is, especially for children who have either any kinds of what are constructed as behavior issues, AD, anything to do with behaviors that are not covered by IDEA, it ensures your right to be in a classroom and not be kicked out. What happens is because kids of color do not have that label, and I put that, are not protected by Section 504. These were the kids who were being sent to alternative school and things. So there was, I hadn't thought about it till I suddenly saw that there was a direct link between a law that is celebrated, and that's what I mean by the problem. It's not to say throw the baby in the bathwater, but to see a law that because because you have to, this is when parents, because the school, it's also unfunded, right? Mm-hmm. So the school requires parents, and if you cannot afford health insurance or get access to a psychologist who will say, because the school's not going to prove that, and parents don't even know. So that a lot of white parents know and have access, and those are also, it's even little things like having extra time in an exam. But kids, if you don't have access to that, you don't. So the law in that case becomes, that's what I mean by saying it becomes meaningless, because it is so driven by class. It's also poor parents too. So in this case, it crosses. It's like poor parents and poor parents and parents of color and parents who don't have access to this kind of information. So we've had Section 504 since when?
1973.
73, and we are talking in 2018. And there are people who do not even know that they could use it. And there are people who are unwilling to use it in order to enable children who have been treated, have historically been thought of as useless from not being part of even getting the basic education. And so I just wanted to say that in that context, so it's not like throwing baby out the bathwater. It's really about thinking about the ways in which communities, which bodies are allowed to, and what does it mean within these different spaces for different kinds of people? Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying. There is a huge challenge when you are in a school situation to have to prove that you have a disability first, and I have experienced this personally myself, and the amount of hoops that you have to jump through in order to get accommodation proved that you need in order to be able to attend school. And at any point in any time, the Disability Services Office or the people who are in charge of the IEP can say, and actually it's different between IEP and between going to college or uni, can say, oh, well, we need more proof. And then you say, well, what kind of proof do you need? Well, we can't tell you that. We just have to tell you that we need more proof. And it's the cyclical argument of, you have to tell me so I know what to inform the doctor, because my authority as a person who knows my body, who knows that I have this, is completely irrelevant. I have no agency. It has to be another person with lots of letters after their name to prove that what I say is actually true, because there's also the perception of gaming the system. But it is like having a full-time job to be the person who is managing everything having connected with a 504, going under 504, or trying to get access to get accommodations for an education. And in the place of an IEP, it's the parent's responsibility. And if they don't have the education or the exposure to know that they do have those rights, and they can insist on things, then the child doesn't benefit from an education that they may, that they should have. As a university student, I had a full-time job as being an advocate for myself so I could get my education. 90% of my time, 80 to 90% of my time was spent advocating for my rights. And the other 10, 15, 20% was spent actually studying for my classes and trying to be a successful student. And it shouldn't be that way.
That's a question over here, I think.
I actually just wanted to pose a quick question before we move on. So I'm hearing a lot about, or thinking about intersectionality in the ways in which all of you folks are talking about it, and thinking about differential access to particular services or access to particular ways in which laws are actually materialized. So previously, intersectionality was talked about as kind of like vulnerability or potential of vulnerability. And I want to pose the question perhaps in a different way. So thinking about intersectionality, as on the one hand, the perhaps predisposition and vulnerability to violence, for instance. But on the other hand, it also means that in a space in which relational inequality happens, that's also about particular folks having access to things and having access that is predicated on other people's inability to have access. So I think my question is, what are the ways in which thinking about intersectionality as a nexus of vulnerability and then thinking about it as a nexus to access to power kind of inform some of the things that you've been saying thus far?
All right, I'll try to take a crack at that. So I've heard Angela Davis talk about this before, and hopefully folks know that. I mean, Dr. Angela Y. Davis, I feel like she's like an aunt, and we can just say Angela Davis. But she talks about marginalized groups, specifically Black women and queer folks. The biggest oppressors to them will be straight Black men and white men, and she says that because Black men will want to reach the standard that white men have, and white men's standard relies on the oppression of everyone. So maybe that was like good enough synopsis for that. Yeah.
To follow up on that, I think really something that I was trying to get at is like I think a lot of the topics that we're talking about, when we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about disability, and talking about class, often get separated from one another as kind of discrete categories. And I think the pull towards thinking about intersectionality is about thinking about the ways in which all of those things come to be played together, and also recognizing that all of those categories are something that everyone is implicated in a particular type of system. So for instance, if we're talking about race, we're not necessarily talking about other races, but we're also talking about whiteness and how whiteness is constructed and the ways in which whiteness becomes part and parcel of access to power in different ways. And we can talk about that in terms of gender and masculinity. We can talk about that in terms of middle and upper middle class folks, in terms of class, and able-bodied and sane or perceived to be sane folks, and sanist kind of rhetoric. So if there's anything in those lines that you potentially like to add to.
I'd like to add, it's interesting when we talk about intersectionality, we always talk about academics. We don't talk about the people that's actually doing it on the ground. They're not talking about it, they're doing books about it, they're doing it. Patty Byrne from Sins Invalid has always talked about intersectionality since day one. And they're doing it on the ground with disability justice. The group in Chicago that does a lot of police battalion Black youth, Candace, that's her name. She's doing it on the ground. I think we need to really lift the people that's doing it on the ground and have examples how to do it, not how to talk about doing it, but how to do it, and to give them a lot of support and platforms to talk about it. Because I always hear academics talking about it, and I don't really see the support that people are doing on the ground. Sins Invalid has been doing this work for the last 12 years. I helped start, and talking about disability justice, talking about transgender, talking about race, talking about disability, and really doing it. When they go to a performance, it's like, who's not in the group? How can we make this place more accessible to everyone? And it's hard work. It's not a grant proposal. It's not a hashtag. It's hard 24/7 hour work. So yeah.
All right, so we're about 8 minutes away from wrapping this up. So I think we can take about one more question. and ask the respondents to respond to that.
There was a question here. Do you still have a question?
Yeah.
Thank you. I was just having some reflections in relation to the role of policy and legislation. And then, Nirmala, when you started to talk about 504, I was thinking about IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what you had said earlier, Leroy, if I'm recalling correctly, you said your mother rescued you from special education in 1979. Is that what you said? Yeah. So I was thinking about how that legislation, when IDEA was one of its revisions in the early 2000s, to focus on racial disproportionality in special education, and this notion of statistically more students of color being represented and segregated, identified in certain federal disability categories. Then thinking about the part of that revision that states that the state education agency has to surveil or regulate those numbers, but that significant discrepancy or difference has to be a result of, quote, inappropriate identification for there to be any sort of, again, still vague and ambiguous response to that. And I was just thinking about this notion of state-sanctioned violence, and even in a policy, a legislative policy that is on the surface supposed to be attending to a form of, if I could argue, state-sanctioned violence at the intersection of race and disability, there is this very glaring, I think, loophole or clause that is I'm thinking of it as this like cloak of benevolence under which ableism and white supremacy is able to hide, because it's the white special ed teacher or whoever. I mean, I don't want to just say like that guy from the presentation, but because they think of themselves as doing right by students of color, students with disabilities, and this deficit ideologies, but also maintains their superiority. They're non-disabled, their white superiority, and this like cloak of benevolence is this other form of sort of state-sanctioned, state-supported violence. So just thinking that through as I'm listening to all of you, and just appreciate you stimulating some thoughts.
It's interesting that and it's it's there, is that we have to go to the state to get justice for the state's doing wrong. This is a total cycle that just blows my mind. Kayla Moore, a case in Berkeley, a transgender disabled person. We the family and activists just went to court. And, after, 3-4 years, they threw most of the case out and left the ADA in, saying that cops didn't give Kayla Moore accommodation. And the case just finished like a couple months ago, and the judge was like, oh no, the police gave Kayla Moore accommodation. So it's like, yeah, I mean, how can we fight the state when we're using these laws, but, the judge just still don't see, the connection of it, I mean, under the ADA public accommodations, you have to make an accommodation. In Kayla Moore, in the Kayla Moore's case, the police didn't make no accommodation. They were on their stomach, handcuffing this person. That's not accommodation. But how can we, change the judge to say, how can you rule that that's an accommodation, and it can come back again about voting, I guess, voting more laws, more judges that have disability experience, and keeping them on their toes, so make sure that these judges don't get corrupt, because, the police union is a powerful union. So we really have to make sure that these judges don't get corrupt. Because we can have all the laws in the books. If the judges is like, oh no, they didn't, abuse Kayla's accommodation, and it's common sense. Kayla was alive before the police got there, and Kayla's dead now. I mean, it's common sense, but yeah.
The only thing I'll add to that is we have to start thinking of new ways to hold elected officials accountable. If we're not holding them accountable, then they're going to get away with anything. And all of these laws that I talked about, Prop 47, Prop 57, AB 2298, which challenges gang documentation, mean absolutely nothing if there aren't people there who are advocating and making sure that they're implemented and looking at all of the problems, because they're all filled with a ton of problems. The process is just horrible in developing them. So really figuring out what are ways that we can hold these officials accountable that we haven't necessarily seen, and break away from this notion that civic engagement is only voting. It's a small part of it. And just because you didn't vote doesn't mean you can't be civically engaged. And so how judges, I don't know whether it's a majority, a large number of judges don't even have anybody they're running against, right? That's an influential position, right? We should be finding people who we want, who share our values, that we want to run, and we support them and get them elected into those things. And once they're elected, hold them accountable too, instead of thinking that once we vote for something, everything's going to go away.
And I'll be quick. Also, police brutality lawyers need a lot of education on disability. Oh my God, it's totally amazing. I mean, in the Kayla Moore's case, we, the activists, had to really get the lawyer up to date about disability issues. So if you have a lawyer that has no clue about disability, and you're representing a person with a disability in a police case, then the outcome is unavoidable.
I have to run. I have to go pick up my 2-year-old son. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble if I don't do that. On that note.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I apologize. I wanted to respond to a couple things. One thing Khalid said, he said we got to find new ways to hold people accountable. Like, one of the ways that we're doing that is, like, next week we have a candidate forum for our state representatives. We have high school students moderating. We have high school students that develop the questions. We sent 500 letters to folks that are incarcerated to ask them to have their family show up to the forum and ask them to develop questions as well. So, like, there's ways in which we can do it within the system that we have to hold folks accountable. But I also wanted to respond to what you said about there being violence inflicted upon students due to other measures that we don't take into account. Like, I hope that I haven't painted like this really grim picture of Pittsburgh, but it is like a deeply racist place. So, I mean, I can't really avoid that. There's an elementary school where a 9-year-old was on an IEP in the class, exhibited what they called aggressive behavior. The teacher called the police on them. They showed up with 9 police cars for a 9-year-old. So when that happened, at the same school a month later, 11-year-old was having like an asthma attack, said that they were having an asthma attack. They didn't. Went to the school nurse sent her back to class, this whole rigmarole. Ends up, she is in an asthma attack, has to go to the hospital. This is a black girl. Now the mother comes to the school upset because she's like, hey, like, my daughter has asthma, she needed her inhaler, you didn't give her an inhaler. they called the police on her because she was aggressive. So like we talk about intersectionality and the ways in which it might play out, but these are very real ways in which they do. Like it's hard to advocate within the system when you're talking to majority young white women, typically privileged, that are working in some of these schools for a year, maybe 2 years to build their resumes, that don't necessarily understand the community or the students. And then you have the people from those communities trying to be advocates for laws that are like hidden from us our entire lives. So like there's this perfect storm that happens to inflict violence upon students. Like, I mean, there's ways to, you know, like reclaim that space. There's ways to bring community into those spaces, because those harm reduction measures are like absolutely critical and vital. As much as we want to change the system, me in my case, I want to overthrow like systems of policing and systems of imprisonment, we still have to focus on harm reduction, because these are lives that will actually be lost. Like I've heard teachers say to students, you know, a student will profess that they're feeling upset or something, and they'll say a word, a bad word, or whatever a bad word is, and the teacher will say, well, why would you say that to me? I'm the only person that will actually go to bat for you. You know, I'll always be here for you, type of thing. But like these are like really subtle and violent ways in which educators or other people inflict violence on students. Like when we talk about, like I said, I don't believe in the school to prison pipeline, but I believe in school as an auxiliary in some locations. I'm talking about the sound of the doors when they close, the sound of the bells when they ring. I'm talking about the policing and the actual monitoring of students to go use the bathroom, the monitoring of them if they need to use the bathroom or if they need to drink water and the water has lead in it. Like there's all of these similarities that we can tie from school to prison. All it takes is like walking into a prison and then walking into a school. You'll see the same single file lines. If you go to a charter school, which is publicly funded, you'll see the same uniformed polos, dark color, you know, just in case there's a spill. Like all of these things that we create and inflict violence upon folks, but it's hard to like actually identify, and it takes for people to, you know, become 21 or 24 and actually go through these systems to say like, you know, this might have been a point where I could have, you know, altered the trajectory of my career or my life. Yeah, so I just want to say I hear you, and what you said was like really valuable.
I know there's a large crowd outside waiting for Leroy's performance. I hate to cut off this conversation that's been really, really fabulous. I want a really big hand of applause for everybody, including all of you.